Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the Kansept Knives Reverie. But first off, before I go any further, I want to thank Kansept Knives for sending this guy along. They reached out to me, said, hey Nick, here are some of the new releases for the year. Are any of these interesting? I said, yeah, that one actually looks kind of cool. And they did send it along. Nonetheless, they know the story. I told them, as always, I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. Sent them the disclaimer on my website. They did still send it along. Nonetheless, we do have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever, and I'm doing my best not to let that affect the nature or quality of my review. Next thing, let's do some size comparison. Here it is against the Spyderco Delica, as always. And what we see here is it's actually right in Delica size territory in terms of handle, at least on this dimension. Even though the blade length is longer. And again, we are right in the territory of the Rat 2, which is, there you go. And then here it is against the Spyderco PM2, which is a very, very different knife and a little bit on the bigger side, right? We see that this guy comes in substantially larger than the Reverie here. So there is that. Next thing, this knife, in case you couldn't tell from this little bit right here, is designed by Justin Lundquist. Lundqvist is right here, Lundqvist Reverie S35VN. Lundqvist is a designer who is pretty well known at this point in the everyday carry community. Has made a bunch of different knives for a bunch of different people. The Kaiser Feist, the Wee Knives, Black Void Opus, more recently. He's done a bunch of stuff, and including this pattern right here. It's one of those little motifs that makes me look at that and go, yeah, Lundqvist, okay, cool. And so, yeah, it's a Lundqvist. And so that's kind of neat, and I believe this might be his first with Kansept. Maybe I'm making that up, but at the very least, that's kind of cool to see him spreading the love a little bit. So let's go on ahead and talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this very interesting little knife. So on the good side, to start with, the ergos on this guy are pretty solid, right? This works out pretty well in the hand. It is relatively thick, and actually, that is one thing I want to do a quick comparison of real quick. Next to the Spyderco Delica, yeah, this is a relatively thick boy. But as a result, though, because it is relatively thick and bolster lock style, it does fit pretty well in the hand, and the clip is well designed such that it doesn't provide much in the way of hot spot. Ergonomically speaking, I would say this is a win. Is it perfect? Maybe not. The clip is a little higher here, but generally speaking, this is pretty good. This is on the upper end of the ergo world. So that's good. Next thing, this is very distinctive. What I mean by that is you take a look at this and you go, oh, Lundqvist, right? It feels like a lot of his stuff, and considering his stuff tends to be multifaceted, it is nice that you see something that's compellingly him, right? That is one of the hallmarks, at least in my mind, of a good designer is distinctiveness, or a good artist, generally speaking. If you look at something, you're like, oh yeah, that's them. That is kind of cool. Next thing, I appreciate that this is a bolster style knife. What I mean by that is that what you have here is effectively a titanium frame lock, except you have these carbon fiber bolsters on both sides. What that means is two things. A, functionally speaking, it keeps your fingers largely off the lock bar. As you are holding this guy, you're not pressing in down on the lock bar, which is going to make this open reliably a little bit more readily. See, as I'm getting ready to flip this guy, I'm resting on the carbon fiber rather than applying pressure here, which would increase the detent. That's nice, and frankly, it also is pretty attractive. It gives them a place to put some kind of a material here, and although I don't even know that carbon fiber is the place I would go here, I mean, this with a nice micarta could be really nice, but nonetheless, the bolster approach is very good. Next thing, the size on this is totally fine. If we take a look at this guy measurement-wise, we are coming in here uncontroversially under 3 inches, which is going to make this legal for a lot of folks, and it's a nice size overall, right? I'm a big fan of this size range. I think it works pretty well for a lot of people in daily life. Next thing, clip on this guy is fine. It's kind of it's a little bit more fabric-y, if anything. What I mean by that is it's very organic, it's flowy rather than being, you know, I hope that describes it well. Anyways, I digress. But it's a nice looking clip. I think it works well, and it works well with the design of the knife overall. Action on this guy is fine. It is very reliable with a little bit of practice. The more you use it, easier it becomes. And I say that not because it's hard, but just because, well, it takes a second, right? So there is that. Next thing, this guy has a nice blade with a very reasonable edge thickness. If I deploy the blade out here, what we're going to see is it comes down to a reasonable thin edge. Not the thinnest thing ever, but it absolutely works. And it's a good blade design overall, right? You have a little bit, it's almost borderline clip pointy. But nonetheless, it's micro micro buoy-ish. It's a good blade, though, and an S35 VN is an absolutely fine steel. It is good to go for everyday carry. So, yeah, that's the blade on this guy is nice. And so, to me, that's the good, is that it's got a nice blade, a fine action, a fine clip. It's got a good size, nice bolsters, some very clear Lundqvist design touches, and very good ergonomics. On the great side, to me, it is the flipping mechanism, 100%. So, this is not really a front flipper. A front flipper in the classical sense is this, where you have something on the front of the knife that you can then use your thumb to pop over like so. And it's certainly not a classical flipper, which, tell me I don't have a flipper on the table right now. That's amazing. Okay, like this guy, this is the Herman Knives Sting, where in this case you have the protuberance on the back, which you press backwards and deploys the knife, right? This guy is kind of a top flipper. I don't quite know what to call it, right? It's kind of a front flipper, and you can open it like a front flipper using kind of the lighter style grip. But for me, the best thing that works is actually put my finger on the top of this guy and pull back, right? And it is cool, right? This is not necessarily it's not unique, so to speak. I've seen it before in other things. This is like the Pena front flipper trapper. This is the Zulu, done, in collaboration with Rayot. But what we have here is a very similar approach, where you can put your finger on the top, pull back, but it is a very nice approach because it is very compact, right? This doesn't take up any more space particularly. I mean, okay, there's like an eighth of an inch or something like that hanging off the top there, but it's very compact. It works very well. It's very nice in the pocket. There's nothing hanging out the back. There's nothing hanging off the front. It's relatively round. This is just really well done, and it's very easy to deploy, right? You take this out of your pocket. Your hand is already basically in the position. When you extract this, your hand is already basically in the position to open it the rest of the way. This is just nice, honestly. I think it's a really nice mechanism, and this is probably the best implementation of it I've seen. The Pena one is very good as well, but for me, this little tiny rounded thing across a rounded top, it just works really well. I think this is just great. And so to me, what's great about this knife 100% is that top flipper approach. It just works really exceptionally well. On the bad side, to start with, very subjectively, I really don't care for the all-black look on this. I said, hey, send me one, and they sent me one, and it turned out to be this one. I feel like this is probably the least attractive of them, but, partly because it ends up feeling a little 50 Shades of Gray, right? Because you got gray, because they're all not perfect black. Carbon fiber isn't perfect black. This is a sort of a black wash thing, where it's done some kind of black coating and then stone washed. The blade on itself, again, is a little bit of black wash, but again, it ends up kind of all blending together and being a little bit less interesting than I think it could have otherwise been. And so it ends up feeling maybe a little bit cheapier to me, but for some people they'll love it, but I think this is probably the least compelling version. I encourage you, if you're looking at this knife and going, yeah, well, that one's ugly, yeah, but there are other versions that aren't, right? So do check that out. Next thing, price on this guy is okay. We're looking at $185, and at some level, it's S35 VN, which is becoming, although I would argue it's still a super steel, it's becoming a little bit more in the middle of the road. And it is overseas made. But the thing is, it's a fine design. It's made well. There's really not much to complain about in terms of quality. By the way, the top of the blade is crowned here, which is something I didn't mention. But it's rounded off on the top, which is a nice little detail. But anyways, so if you love the look, you're going to love the knife, even at this price. But there is definitely also better value. If you're just looking at raw performance, you can get American-made 20CV in that kind of a price range. So, take it for what it's worth. You'll be happy paying that if you're really loving the design. But otherwise, it's not like, oh my god, I need one just because the price is so good. Next thing, this guy is just barely recurved. What I mean by that is if I put this blade up against a flat edge here, you're going to see there's a little tiny gap right up in this area here. It's not much, but it is just enough that if you're going on a flat bench stone, it's going to make things a little more difficult. I don't know whether this is actually a sharpening issue, meaning that this choil wasn't quite long enough and so it ends up curving a little bit. Or maybe they're on a thinner sharpener and the person sharpening just took a little bit more of a bite here. I don't know, but it's very, very barely recurved. It's not the end of the world, but it is something that's going to be a thing. Pardon me. Next thing. One downside to this guy is it is a little bit on the thick side. I mean that actually in a couple of ways. I mean, to start with, anytime you got a bolster lock, it's going to be a little bit on the thicker side, but the blade on this guy is a little bit thicker than I feel like it needs to be. If we take a look at the blade stock here, we're looking at maybe 3 3, 4 millimeters, someplace in that. It is not the thinnest blade stock ever. And the thing is, this is something that feels like it's borderline traditional, right? It's sort of playing in that modern traditional space. And I really do love seeing super thin, slicey blades on those rather than these kinds of thicker things. And I think this knife would just be better in terms of carryability if it were a little bit thinner overall, right? I don't know why they didn't. I'm sorry, I don't know why they went with this thicker stock. It just feels like they could have thinned this out a little bit. It would have carried better. It just would have been a better knife, I think, overall. Not the end of the world, but it is a thing. Then finally, there's a little bit of an incongruity with it, right? Because at some level, with the thicker stock, it feels a little bit more like it's made for harder use, but it's designed like a very, and named, frankly, like a very fancy knife. It's sort of like they're not 100% sure what to do with this design. I think it's a design that's got a lot of potential, but I sort of would have liked to have seen it done a little bit fancier, like, here we go. This little guy right here, this is the Kansept Accipiter, well, the mini Accipiter. I feel like this knife done with a finishing more along those lines would have been much more interesting, would have been a little bit more compelling, rather than going sort of high-speed, low-drag, thick blade tactical on it, right? I think they could have done a little bit differently there, and it would have made a little bit more sense. But anyways, that's all pretty subjective, right? Just my thoughts, well, it's always just my opinions, right? But anyways, to me, that's what's bad here, is the design's a little incongruous with the thick blade and the color scheme. It is just barely recurved, and the price is okay. It's not crazy value, but it's not bad either, particularly. Ugly front, there's nothing really ugly here, so let's go to the final conclusion, which is that this is a fine little knife, right? It's got solid ergos, distinctive designs, nice bolsters, a good size, a nice clip, a fine action, a nice blade, and a pretty effective and enjoyable flipper approach. This, to me, yeah, that's the win. The color scheme's a little weird. The value's okay at best. There's a hint of recurve, and it's a little thick and just kind of a little bit weirdly implemented. But honestly, I like the knife. I think it's pretty well done here. One big, strong conclusion here is that this flipper tab is pretty great, right? I really hope that we see more of this design, both from Kansept and more widely in the knife market. I think this is a really nice approach, and if you can do the detent right, and I think the bolster or liner lock is going to be one of the keys there, because any degree of lock bar tension is going to make it too strong for this to work. But nonetheless, this is a very nice approach. It's a nice solution. It's great in the pocket, and we should see more of that from Lundqvist and, frankly, everywhere. But there's that. The other conclusion is that this is another one of those that's kind of a design piece. What I mean by that is that as a knife, you know what, it's good to go, right? I carried this, I used it, it worked great. There's really no complaints with it as a pocket knife. It's fine. Kansept is doing good work and creating pieces that are well done overall, right? But it's also relatively middle of the road in terms of function, in terms of value. And so my ultimate recommendation on this guy ends up being, okay, look at the knife. Take a good stroll. Here, let's look at the other side. Okay, do you want to buy the knife now? If you're looking at this design, does that make you want to buy the knife? If you don't get it, if you're looking at it like, no, I don't want that, it's ugly. If it's not grabbing you, then don't, right? There's nothing here that is compelling enough to overcome the design if you don't love the design. But if you're loving the look, then I think you're going to love this knife. It's probably going to be a gem for you, and you'll probably want to snap out of your Reverie just long enough to buy the piece. So anyways, there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.